Destiny 2 has changed quite a lot since its launch back in 2017. In fact, comparing it to what we have now, it's almost an entirely different game. So much has been gradually updated and changed and removed and replaced over time. There aren't many games that have had the strange and unique journey of Destiny 2. I actually still have terabytes of footage on my hard drives that I never got around to deleting of pretty much every stage of Destiny 1 and 2. And every now and again, out of curiosity, I'll go through and look at the footage, and I'm always blown away by what the game was actually like in its first year. So in this video, we're going to go on a bit of a nostalgic history trip. I've dug through all my archives and picked out some of the best and most interesting clips, which might surprise some of you, especially if you're newer to the game. And even if you aren't, I guarantee you will have forgot a lot of what I'm about to show you. But I think it'll be some good perspective just to show how much Bungie have evolved the game undeniably for the better. A lot of people compare Destiny 1 to Destiny 2, but I think honestly comparing Destiny 2 now to 2017's Destiny 2 is just as interesting. The majority of the launch content physically isn't in the game anymore. You can't play this stuff. Most of it won't be coming back, and it's like this forgotten game that's been slowly replaced and built upon. So many characters are dead, the planets are gone, the whole campaign is gone, the loot is sunset. So what we have now is almost more like Destiny 2.5 or 2.7, as Bungie kind of add in what would have been the Destiny 3 content on top instead of making that separate third game. So there's no sponsor in this video, but if you'd like to support the channel, all I ask is that you gently click the like button down below. It's much appreciated. And while you're down there, you might as well also subscribe so you don't miss a new video. But with that being said, we're going to rewind all the way back to 2017, a simpler time. There's a ton that I want to show you, and we'll start with some of the gameplay differences, which were massively different. And then we'll also talk about some of the activities and the very first events, like the first Xur visit, for example, and Iron Banner and Trials, and also the content roadmap back in the day as well. As far as gameplay though, by far one of the craziest differences was the entire weapon system. It was super weird and very rough around the edges, and this was an iteration brought on because of Destiny 1 and some changes that Bungie wanted to make along the way, but as we know, a lot of this would end up being changed. So the most notable thing is, of course, double primaries. The entire game you were stuck with, there was no special and primary system. They were based on slots. So the first slot was only kinetic primary weapons. The second slot was only energy weapons, but still primary weapons essentially. And the third slot was essentially a hybrid between special and heavy. Looking back at this gameplay is almost painful because there is just so much primary gunplay, because like I said, you've got basically double primaries, one with an element, one without. There's very little perks, there's very little abilities, there's very little synergy or builds or anything interesting going on besides just shooting at pretty much bullet sponges with lots of primary ammo and just slowly whistling them down. Now, how this affected the game across both PvE and PvP was quite different. Now, in Crucible, which we'll talk a lot more about in a second, Crucible essentially was just a lot more slower, but it wasn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. It definitely wasn't good, but it just made things a lot slower, a lot more around gunplay. Now, the intention behind why Bungie did this was essentially try and simplify the weapon classes and make it so that each player had a signature weapon in your heavy slot, and that kind of defined what you were, whether a shotgun or a sniper or a fusion rifle. Imagine those were the heavy choices, but it essentially gave you a role which you would play, and it would kind of make things a bit simpler. But again, in practice, didn't end up being too successful, but in PvE was where it was most noticeable. Now, the next thing that added on top of the weapon system to make it just feel even more weak was the actual perks on the weapons themselves. These were kind of hilarious, but you can see the perk trees were so basic. So the amount of perks you can actually get was very limited. As you can see, this is my original Better Devils, and it's got literally 2 magazine perks. These barely affect the weapon. You've got Extended Mag and also Flared Magwell, and the only actual interesting perk is Explosive Payload. That was it. That was the entire Better Devils, and to make it even worse, there was no such thing as random rolls back then. This is one of the biggest changes that I'd almost wiped from my memory, but Bungie were adamant on not having random rolls. They didn't want the RNG, they didn't want the randomness. I was completely in the opposite camp. I was certain that random rolls is just the core of Destiny. It's what makes the game fun. The randomness, not knowing what you're going to get. But the downside of this, of course, was that every single weapon was the same. If you get Better Devils, every single one is the exact same. There's no reason to chase another one. This was also before the days of masterworking and kill trackers, so this of course came later on, but Back in the day, there wasn't even any masterwork option. The only thing you did have was a mod slot, but on the kinetic weapons, it did literally nothing. All it did was actually give you a +5 to your power level, which was super random. I didn't really understand at the time, but that was all the mod systems did on all primary weapons. So guns as a whole were very one-dimensional. You probably recognize there are certain few that were pretty much the good ones, like the Minuet, the Nightshade, Uriel's Gift, the Antelope was good in PvP, also the Nameless Midnight, which you can see I've got here 5,000 kills. But what this ended up doing was essentially limiting the loot pool and of course the replay value of the game, which wasn't the worst thing in the very first couple months of the game, because obviously everything was new, there was a lot to do, but as the game got older, of course, you got every weapon in the game and you were pretty much done. There was no reason to chase any random rolls and there was no replay value to continue getting this loot, which as a game like Destiny, the loot is quite important. So having something to chase was almost gone once you got these weapons. The armor perks were almost just as hilarious. Forget any idea of any builds or synergy or perks that did anything really. You had a built-in intrinsic perk such as heavy hunter armor, for example. This would increase your resilience, and then you'd have a choice of either something like resilience or recovery, although with a hunter it was very rare you get those two. There'd almost always be mobility. This was also before the days of intellect, discipline, and strength, which of course were a core of Destiny 1, but those were not added into Destiny 2. So it was only until Forsaken a year later those were added as additional perks, which just made the builds a little bit more cohesive. But before then, it was just mobility, recovery, and resilience. Now, exotics were also in a very rough place, probably the worst they've ever been in Destiny history, to be honest. The launch exotics are still to this day, I mean, a lot of them still need a buff, but at the time, most exotics were quite weak, especially to ones we were used to by year 3 of Destiny 1. Some of the better exotic weapons I remember were Vigilance Wing, that was really good in Crucible, the Mida as well, that was king of Crucible at the very beginning. The Merciless was very good for melting in PvE. The Watercliff Coil was pretty good, and Legend of Acrius as well did a ton of damage. It was very hard to get from the raid. Some of the worst ones were things like the Sturm, that was a joke. The Rat King, the Fighting Lion was a huge meme at the time. Again, these are all pre-buff. The Graviton Lance is very bad. Borealis was a PlayStation exclusive. You had things like the Prospector and the Darcy, which were still very, very weak. Some of the armor pieces I remember, of course, you guys would know the Orpheus Rigs. To be fair, that was still, in my opinion, one of the best exotics in Destiny history. Those things were ridiculous, but there weren't many other exotics like it. There were things like the Celestial Nighthawk was good for damage, the Knucklehead in Crucible, the Raiden Flux was good in PvE, the Lunafaction and Transverses for Warlocks. And there were also some very, very bad armor pieces like the Feedback Fence for the Titan that did like 1 damage or something ridiculously low. The Trick Sleeves were a joke, and also the Wings of Sacred Dawn as well just held you in midair. So a lot of these were very weak before they got buffed, and at launch they just weren't feeling very exotic. Something else with the loot system was how it was actually obtained, and the biggest thing back then was tokens. A lot of you might remember if you were around back then, tokens were the bane of existence and the entire game was basically tokenified. Bounties actually didn't exist back then, believe it or not. There were no bounties, only these things called challenges, which were kind of built in, and they would be a similar thing, but they weren't selectable and they weren't nearly as good as bounties. But now, of course, tokens have been gradually phased out. Most vendors don't have them anymore, and now the game is almost entirely about bounties. Looking at the director screen, this is what you would see if you looked in the first couple months before Curse of Osiris added Mercury, of course, but in these early days, you only had the 4 original locations of Titan, Earth, Io, and Nessus, and then you had the Almighty, which is a couple missions there, you couldn't really go there. You had Crucible and Strikes, and also, of course, the Leviathan, which itself was a surprise. Now, something super interesting to look at is the very first original roadmap for the first month of content. Now, the game obviously launched on the 6th of September. That was a Wednesday. That week, it was the Nightfall of the Arms Leader, the very first Nightfall ever. And these things called flashpoints. Remember those? That was actually on the EDZ. The next week, you would have the Inverted Spire Nightfall, and then the flashpoint on Nessus. You had the Leviathan, and then Trials of the Nine would be that following weekend, and also Xur. Now, by far, one of the best things, hands down, that Bungie ever added, and still, in my opinion, an absolute masterpiece, was the Leviathan, especially the way they introduced it. This was a complete surprise to the players. We had no idea that something like the Leviathan existed, an entire destination dedicated to the raid with essentially a patrol space, the entire underbelly, which was a massive, massive puzzle. The Leviathan was still one of the most impressive things Bungie have ever added. The raid itself was a little bit different to the style of raids we'd normally got because there weren't that many bosses. That was a kind of main criticism. Still, I think it was very commendable the way they tried to do something different, and it did fit the Cabal lore. And just the fact of going onto this ship and trying to prove yourself to this Cabal emperor that you'd then meet, You can see this is footage of our actual very first completion on day 1 of the Leviathan raid, but you can see my weapons being an auto rifle and tonne shot and a sniper in the heavy. Not the best DPS, but yeah, the arrival of this giant ship shaped like a worm that eats planets and has this Cabal Emperor was definitely really cool, and I think still one of the highlights of the D2 launch. Now, as far as the Crucible, this was a very interesting place, and to be honest, it wasn't all entirely bad. Definitely not as bad as PvE, I'd say. Crucible it was very different. It was very slow, a lot focused on gunplay, and there was pretty much nothing else to do. You'd be lucky if you get your super once in a game. You'd be lucky if you get 1 grenade in a game. The abilities were very, very slow. Everything was slow, to be honest. The movement speed was slow. The kill time was slow. There was no such thing as 6v6. Remember that as well. It was only 4v4. The entire Crucible, as you would imagine, as well as all those other things I listed, it slowed down the game just ridiculously to a point where only primary weapons would go. And like I said, it wasn't entirely all bad. There were elements that I do quite like looking at this gameplay. You'd probably be surprised to know that I'd played thousands and thousands of hours of Destiny. The gunplay and accuracy is on point, but in terms of movement and abilities and just anything besides gunplay, there was basically nothing going on in Crucible. It was just primary weapons, and that's about it. This was obviously console gameplay, but if this gameplay looks extra specially slow, it's because it actually is. The movement speed was also nerfed across the board in Destiny 2. Bungie actually made a specific update. It was actually called the Go Fast update, and that was where they deliberately increased the movement speed of all players because they literally slowed down how fast you could walk and run. On top of that, the TTK, or time to kill, was a big talking point, and this wouldn't even get buffed until a whole year later in Forsaken, but the time to kill was so slow it took 3 melees to kill someone. Imagine running up to someone and slapping them 3 times in a row. But yeah, Crucible was a very, very different place, a lot slower, and again, like I said, it wasn't entirely all bad. It was kind of nice to just focus on gameplay, and the reason Bungie did it was because Destiny 1 by year 3 received a lot of criticisms. There was too much going on, too many abilities, too fast, too many supers, and not enough focus on gunplay. But Destiny 2, they tried to make it super competitive and clean, and hopefully with esports in mind, and they tried to make it all about gunplay, and many would argue they went a little bit too far in that direction. And then over the next year, they would gradually make it a little bit faster and more interesting with more stuff going on, to the point where now you would argue it's a little bit too far in that direction again. It kind of just swings back and forth like a pendulum, but right now I think many would argue there is way too much going on in Crucible, so it's a very, very stark difference to what we had. Also, footage of our very first ever Trials of the 9 game back on the 15th. This file is actually 30 gigabytes. I wish I could delete it, but this is a 2-hour recording of the very first card we played, and it was very cool to play on Eternity, of course, a brand new map. As you can see, Mida was king. It was definitely the best weapon in the game at the time, and this was a very interesting experience. It was cool because, again, like I said, it was very gunplay focused, but it was very team shot focused as well. But as we know, Trials of the 9 didn't really have the legs that Trials of Osiris had, and it didn't stand up as well, so Bungie did end up axing it. By far one of the funniest and most notable points was the intro screens, where it displayed everyone's loadout and animations, and it was so hilariously long. I just was so surprised this even made it through the game, but you'd be sat there for about an hour watching everyone's emotes. Is probably why this file size is so big, to be honest, but that was something that eventually got fixed. But Trials of the 9 was definitely very interesting. Xur's very first ever visit in D2 was actually a pretty good one. He brought some decent exotics, although it doesn't look like much here with this inventory. But Merciless was definitely one of the best weapons in the entire game. It was kind of like the G-Horn. It was the only decent boss DPS. The Raiden Flux is also top tier for the Arcstriders. The Doomfang, I can't remember exactly how good they were. I didn't play much Titan. And the Winged Sacred Dawn were pretty awful. But that was Xur's very first ever visit. And his inventory was a lot more lackluster than Destiny 1, where he had exotic engrams, he had some random elements, he had ornaments, believe it or not, and sparrow drives and heavy ammo, 3 of coins, needles, and I think motes, and also exotic shards as well. 2 weeks later would see the very first introduction of faction rallies, which was much anticipated. In Destiny 1, factions were pretty well integrated as a basically additional loot and reputation vendor. They're a decent core element of the game, but of course we want to see more of them in terms of PvE gameplay and lore and just the faction wars kind of theme. But in Destiny 2, they added the faction rallies, which kind of was well received, but also ended up kind of being a massive token farm as well. It was decent for its time, and it was something else to do, but of course the mode didn't have that much depth, and Bungie would then go on to axe the event, and it wouldn't return since. The following month would see the introduction of the Prestige Leviathan version, which is basically hard mode, and this went down decently well. It was quite a hard activity, but most of the rewards were cosmetic, so it didn't feel that rewarding. And then there was also the first ever Iron Banner for Destiny 2, and one of the best things about this, I remember, was the Lord Saladin actually voicing the mode. He was the commentator, which was different to Destiny 1. In Destiny 1, Shaxx commentated everything, Crucible, Trials, and Iron Banner. In Destiny 2, I always thought it would be really cool to have these vendors narrate them, and that's exactly what they did. So it was a really nice touch to have Saladin actually narrating the mode, and it made it feel a little bit different. But yeah, that was the very first Iron Banner of Destiny 2 back in October of 2017. I think that's going to do it for this history lesson. Like I said, this was just the tip of the iceberg. I've got terabytes more footage, so let me know if there's more you'd like to see. If you enjoyed the video, then clicking the like button before you go would be much appreciated. If you don't want to miss out on my next upload, then make sure you are subscribed as well. But it goes without saying, I always appreciate you guys that watch till the end and show so much love on these videos. It doesn't go unnoticed, but thanks for taking the time to watch this video, and I'll see you all in the next one.